Who has a hangover? Oh, that's okay, but just 3 or so. Awesome. Okay. Welcome to Modular and Reusable Frontend with HTML5, Sass, and CoffeeScript, which is what this talk is not about. This talk is about the joy of frontend, a journey with Bob Ross. You may not know Bob Ross. I will introduce him in a bit. He was an American painter, and I love the guy. This is one of his paintings. I used to have this television show on TBS, and he paints those pictures in exactly 30 minutes. Now, I've been meaning to do a presentation on Bob Ross for a while. Turns out that when you send in proposals to conferences about Bob Ross talks, you don't get accepted. So he's mixed in some buzzwords like HTML5 and Sass and CoffeeScript and that kind of words. So here we are. So, Bob Ross. Oh, visit Bob. Bob was this white guy sporting an afro, and the only one who could pull that off. And like I said, I used to have this television show on PBS, and it had all these elements, what I call modules, which makes him the inventor of modular painting. He had like a little tree, a crooked tree, a happy little cloud, and he would take all those elements and combine all those elements into unique paintings. So this tree you see here can be in the back, it can be in the front, and by reusing this collection of elements, he creates new paintings. So just like Bob, us developers like to start with a blank canvas. This time, everything is going to go right. We're not going to screw up this time. No refactoring, no whatever. This is going to be awesome code the first try. So we take our blank canvas and we go at it for a few weeks, like Bob Ross riding a unicorn through a sky of rainbows. Everything exists on the internet. Just go to Google and enter Bob Ross unicorn rainbow, and you get this. Totally awesome. So after like 3-4 weeks of coding, you take a step back and you look at your code and you expect it to look like this immaculate Bob Ross painting. But instead you're greeted with something that looks more like a dead rat lying beside a puddle of cat vomit. I'll just take a sip of water while I leave this on so you can enjoy it for a bit while you're hungover. So, how does it happen? What went wrong? Now this is a front-end talk. There's no Ruby, there's no Rails, a little ASCII pipeline. But I'm expecting a lot of you to do some work with HTML and CSS. So what went wrong on the front-end side? Because you had this H1, this heading, and it needs to be black. And this is perfectly okay code. Oh wait, sometimes it needs to be blue and in italics. So you say, well, when it's inside the main or sidebar containers or elements with those IDs, then you just change that font style a little. Oh wait, for the Twitter widget, it needs to be red. So you just add a class name up front, and you need the ban important there, because otherwise it won't work because of CSS specificity. Oh wait, for tweets in the sidebar, it needs to be green. So you just solve it like this, and that works. Oh wait, except once. This one time it needs to be magenta, so just add an extra class name to the H1 and fix it like this. This is how you get code that looks like dead rats lying beside puddles of cat vomit. So let's solve this. As Bob would say, oh, you'd be in Agony City by now. Bob has a lot of wisdom, a lot of great quotes. He's been dead for 15 years, by the way. If you go to bobrossquotes.com, you can actually look them up and learn something from the master. So a little about me. As Flat said, I'm Roy. I come here from Amsterdam, Holland. You may recognize me by my balding head, but I do see there's something that goes around here. A lot of balding people here. Sorry for you guys. I'm a front-end architect, which means I think about large-scale applications. I'm basically just a front-end developer, because like there's only that much you can ask for your hourly rate as a front-end developer. If you call yourself an architect, you can actually double your rate. So pro tip, call yourself an architect and make more money. I'm co-founder of ADB, it's a Ruby consultancy in Amsterdam, and Slicecraft, the only service globally offering PSD to handle Sass, Campus, and CoffeeScript converting services. I'm writing a book about this whole modular front-end thing, so if you want to stay updated on the progress, what did I also like the book? There's my shameless book plug, sorry for that. So a web page is a collection of modules. We used to think of web pages as a page, like we do in print. You have a magazine or something on a page. We need to start thinking more like Twitter Bootstrap. You have these reusable components, you can reuse them throughout your application, and stuff just works. You should be able to take one element on your homepage, copy paste it somewhere else, and it should still work. It should not break because of it relies on some parent container or whatever. So the goal of this approach is to develop your own Bootstrap. Excuse me. Make something Bootstrap-like, but in the style of your own application, because you want to be unique. There's already a gazillion websites out there looking like Twitter Bootstrap, which is mostly okay for admin interfaces, but if you're doing anything consumer-facing, you probably want something a bit more unique. Bob Ross used to be stationed at Eielson Air Force Base in Alaska. This is the gate to the Air Force Base, and this is the website. In case you ever land on this website, do not check out their code, because it is entirely made out of tables. We have not been doing that for the past 15 years, but apparently the US government has a lot of taxpayers' money to spend, so they develop websites in tables. That was the page. These are the components. These are the components that are on that page and you want to reuse throughout your application. Some news, some carousel slider. You want to be able to take all of those and move them from one place to the other. 3 aspects: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. First on HTML5. This is what we used to do with HTML4. We used to have a single H1. Then we had some div, in this case a sidebar, I gave it ID sidebar, that had an H2 in there, because SEO people said you can only use a single H1 on a page. Have an H2 in there, then have some article, a div with a class name article in this case. Have an H3 in there, because we are going by this whole hierarchy of H1, H2, H3, do it like this, and work pretty okay. If you want to have reusable components, this sucks big time. That's why you want HTML5, where you can use new sectioning elements and multiple H1s. So this is the same document made up as an HTML5 document, where there's a site which has an H1. The page itself is an H1. There's an article in there which has an H1, which means you can actually reuse bits of this code without caring about the heavy hierarchy. You don't have to think about H1, H2, H3. You can take any of those, any sectioning element, start with an H1. Now don't go replace all your divs. HTML5 has also new sectioning elements like section and article and header and aside and things like that. They're not always suitable. But in a lot of cases, you can actually get away with using an appropriate HTML5 element. So all sections can start with an H1, and that makes them great partials. Because like I said, you can take any bit and move it anywhere else. HTML5 does not work in IE, unless you use some piece of JavaScript to tell IE what HTML5 elements are called like, so you can actually style them using CSS. Well, if you use Modernizer, which is an awesome tool for feature detection, use that anyway. You can just check the checkbox and say, I want my Modernizer code to come with the HTML5 shift to make shit work in IE. Do that and you're okay. Works in IE6 as well. I guess there's something broken. Anyway, are there any search engine optimization experts here? Oh, I'm so happy. Like a while back, someone actually raised his hand. Yeah, that was fun. SEO experts will say, no, you have to use a single H1, because that's what Google likes. Okay, so I built this HTML5 application, and made it like 15 H1s on a single page, and some SEO expert told me that's too many. Like, okay, so how many should I use? And his answer was, less. Yeah, that's an answer to my question. Like, do you have any metrics, any documentation that tells me why I should use more than a single H1? He did not. Turns out it's bullshit. Google has said so in 2009 already, before HTML5 was mainstream. You're already told that using multiple H1s is fine, as long as you don't drag your entire page in an H1. I'm pretty sure no one here is doing that. So use those multiple H1s and you'll be fine. That's the only way to create these reusable modules that don't rely on the hierarchy they're in. So just use those multiple H1s, use those HTML5 elements. You can do anything you want to do. This is your world. Bob Ross. Let me just take a sip of water while I take a step back and we enjoy this Bob Ross painting. Are you guys enjoying it? I know I am. So modular CSS. You have structure on the side. First you need to find a property designer. You can only have a modular design when it has a modular graphical design. Because those elements need to be the same. Web designers still tend to work graphic designers in pages. They will design each page for an application, and a certain module may appear on 3 of those pages. And it's not uncommon that all of those 3 are slightly different. They are basically exactly the same, except one has a padding of 15 pixels instead of 20, or a slightly different color. So you need a designer that doesn't do that. You need a designer that actually creates stuff that looks the same everywhere, so you can write the code once and reuse it multiple times. You need to determine which modules are unique. So what I like to do is print out all those pages designer made, put them on the wall, take a marker, look at the second page and see what's on this page, what already was on the first page. If that's the case, cross it out, and in the end you will be left with only unique modules. So those are the ones you're going to develop. That takes a lot of paper. Killing trees, if you don't like killing trees, you can just kill kittens or so after determining these common elements, you can go at it. Now often people ask me, but I have this project and I want it to be modular, but it isn't right now, how should I fix that? And I say, well, throw out your code and start over. Turns out people get upset about that, because they're like, yeah, but we have this team of 5 people and we worked on it for 2 years. You don't want to throw the shit out. And on second thought, it kind of makes sense, I guess. So you have to start refactoring. And refactoring is hard. So what I do, the rule of live by is clean code goes in clean files. So I create a new blank CSS file and only copy paste the stuff that I'm actually going to reuse. So in the end I will end up with everything is working, everything's in there, I can just throw out the old CSS files and we'll be fine. So I give modules a new class name. So they go to clash with existing code and copy paste what's needed. You find similar modules, look on other pages, use a new class name there, and see if stuff still works. And you need some leeway to normalize. Like I said, the designer may have made this slight changes per page, and you may have implemented that in the past. So you actually have these small differences in the same module on various pages, just settle on one variation. You don't want too many exceptions, that you get loaded code, and most often the designer won't even notice if there's a 5 pixel difference. But tell them anyway, because otherwise they get upset. We don't want that. So each module gets its own scope. I'll get into that in a bit with some code. I started all my module class names with mod dash. So I know that this class name is about an actual module, and it also means that scope-wise in HTML, if an element's opening tag has a class name that starts with mod dash, I know that the module doesn't end until the closing tag for the same element. You want to use generic class names. Latest news is an awesome name for a module. unless you'll be reusing the same module in a while and using it to show old news. So news or articles would probably be a better fit in that case. So try to be generic. And use shallow selectors. The longer your CSS selector is, the higher the specificity, the harder it is to override things, and the bigger the world of hurt will be you enter. So let's do some code. This section has articles, so it has the class name mod-articles, which indicates it's an articles module. That kind of speaks for itself. So it has an h1, and there are some articles, etc. At the bottom is the CSS. This is Sass code, original Sass syntax, not the shitty SCSS syntax with curly brackets and the semicolons. We wouldn't be doing Ruby if you liked curly brackets and semicolons, so I don't like them in CSS either. Anyway, mod-articles in the CSS, and everything else is indented inside there. So the articles container has a gray background, and the article itself has a blue text color. By nesting an article within mod-articles, it only applies obviously to articles within that module, and it doesn't interfere with anything else in the application. If you do it like this, for exceptions, you do it wrong. You have this article module, which always has a width of 100%, totally fine, scales nicely. But then when it's used in a site, you want it to be 50% wide. If you do it like this, that works perfectly fine. Until you want it to be the same somewhere else, and you need to add a second line under the side space on mod-articles to facilitate the second exception. This will bite you in the ass in the long run. That's why I suggest fixing things like this. Have your default styling apply to the module and use a second class name for any exceptions. So in this case it has two class names, mod-articles, and a second class name narrow that just only describes the difference between the regular module styling and the exception. This should be just reuse. It doesn't say anything about the context it's in, it only says something about the exception for a module. So this is a way better approach if you want to keep your CSS tidy. Now you also have generic modules. Generic modules are things like buttons. You'll use them throughout your application, inside various other modules, and basically you never use them on their own. They're always in a certain context, in a sign-up form, in a blog post with a link to the full article. So for those, use super shallow selectors. Like I said, the longer a selector, the harder it is to override, and that's what we don't want for this. So just keep it super simple. And you don't want to limit this to specific HTML elements either. Something looking like a button, maybe an actual button element, it may be an input type submit, it may be a link styled like a button. So you don't want to link this to, don't want to tie this to a specific HTML element, but keep it as generic as possible. And for variations, again, I like to describe the difference in the second class. And when you see the code, most of you probably think that's so ugly and so unsymmetric, and that's okay. I'll explain why I'll do it like that. So we have a button which has a white text color and a red background color, except when you apply a second class name called blue, and the background color will be blue. Now for ages people have been telling us this is not semantic, and it's true. The class name blue does not say anything about the meaning of the class name or the element. It only says it's going to be blue. That's true. If all your buttons are red and you have one submit button, you just change the class name to submit with a background color of blue. That would work. But what I've often seen in the past is that people have this blue submit button, and you have some other button they want to be blue as well. And they just add the submit class name. So then you end up with a button that has the class names button and submit, but it's not a submit button. To me, that makes even less sense than using some descriptive class name like this one. So that's why I just do it like this. My rule of thumb is the first class name is always descriptive, always has semantic value, and the second one may just describe the difference. Because What's the difference here? It's just the color blue. So in code, this will look like this, used inside the mod articles module. The first one is a button that just has this red background color, and the second one obviously is blue. This whole approach is based on writing code that's easy to implement in the future by backend developers, a lot of you guys, but not having to dive into the CSS. Just change stuff in HTML, much like Twitter Bootstrap, add class names, and stuff should still work. That's the idea of this whole thing, and it's also the idea behind using a non-scripted class name. Now sometimes you have a button that's blue everywhere except for in a certain module. If that's only the case once, you don't add the same class name, you just nest stuff within the module like I did here. The button needs to have a green colored text when it's inside the articles module. I find it's okay to nest it like this. If this would appear in multiple occasions, I would actually use the same class name, green, and move this to the button module and outside of this articles module. Media queries, for those of you not too familiar with media queries, a media query allows you to invoke CSS based on certain parameters, like the width of the browser window, or the height of the browser window, or the pixel density of the device, so you can target retina devices and things like that. Those almost always belong to a module. You have a module that looks a certain way, unless your screen is more narrow than, let's say, 500 pixels. They want some other styling to kick in. That is a dotted module, so keep that inside the module. For that, we can use the power of Sass. We can actually nest media queries inside a class name, like I did here. Turn the background green if the screen is smaller than 400 pixels. Screen width is smaller than 400 pixels. You can nest it in there, and as you see the button, Sass will just take that apart and write val CSS code based on that Sass. Keeps things tidy, and in the end it's just CSS. It works perfectly fine. I often got this question as when I talk, like, is this OO CSS, which Nicole Sutton came up with, or SMAX by Jonathan Snook, which are also modular approaches to writing CSS. This is not. They heavily rely on class names. They just basically add class names everywhere, not just to a module, but also to the H1 in there, to the article in there. They just add class names everywhere. That's basically what Bootstrap does as well, and I'm not too fond of that. I don't like having class names everywhere, and I've learned that a lot of backend developers don't either. You want to just write this clean HTML with little class names, add a single class name on top to the parent element, and things should work. So they use more class names, and I use more child and descendant selectors. That doesn't mean you need to RATFT, refactor all the fucking time. This is something Anthony Eden came up with, so I stole it from him with permission. You need to refactor. When you have this class name approach, a lot of class names, stuff will keep working. When you do it like this with child selectors, like you may say you have a mod articles, and I have some span in there which has a comment count, and that should be in light gray. Okay, that works. Then we add a second span for something else. They would also be light gray. So in that case, you need to do some refactoring to make stuff add up again. That's hard. People are tempted to just throw in more class names and do it like that and go for the quick fix. That doesn't work too well in the long run. I'm talking about websites that may have over 50 different modules. Websites are in development for 9+ months. If you do it like that, it gets real ugly real fast. So keep refactoring, and it doesn't necessarily go about front end only. You should just always keep your code in good condition instead of going for a quick fix. Defining what those modules are is pretty hard. People often think that a whole page is a module. that a module within a module is a module, so it gets hard to see what the unique elements are and what they aren't. So as Bob used to say, this is the hardest part of this method. If you can do this, you can do anything. Such a wise man. And it's also baking time again. So, JavaScript. It has structure, it has styling, now it's on to behavior. To me, a JavaScript module is closely tied to a CSS module. They have the same naming convention. We'll get into file structure a bit later. They have, in this case, there's a section which has the class mod-articles and the ID mod-articles. I use the class name in CSS and the ID for JavaScript. At the bottom, there's some jQuery stuff, just targeting this mod-articles element and calling stuff on it. Because I believe using IDs for CSS is evil. Here's why. When you use IDs in your CSS as well, or you use class names in your JavaScript, you're closely tying together your JavaScript and CSS. If you use a class name exclusively for CSS and an ID exclusively for JavaScript, you actually only have a direct tie between HTML and JavaScript, HTML and CSS, and you don't create this triangle of code. I've learned that it keeps stuff from breaking. You can easily test your backend code, you can test the HTML elements on your page, you can do JavaScript testing, but it's still nearly impossible to test your CSS. If something changes in your CSS and it doesn't show some background image in your application, you're not going to find out with automated testing. So I had this one application where there were people of a certain state or a certain gender, and based on the ID, there will be some JavaScript bindings to it, and we show a little icon. Someone changed the ID, changed the JavaScript test, and everything worked just fine. It took 3 weeks before we found out that all those little background icons were actually gone. They were tied to the ID as well. I believe we're solving that by using exclusively class names for CSS, IDs for JavaScript. Sometimes you have to target a collection of elements for HTML using JavaScript. IDs need to be unique. If you use data attributes, you can use those as a replacement for your class names. So it looks like this. Here are list items here. Classes used for CSS, data attributes used for JavaScript. So we want to say, later on, we want to find all males. So we just have a data-sex attribute. Normally I would use data-gender, but it didn't fit the line, and I like saying sex, so that's basically it. So those don't have to be unique, you just make them up on the spot. If you use HTML5 type, you can create any attribute as long as it starts with data dash, and your code will validate just perfectly fine against the W3C validator. So we have two males. We have Bob, who was married to Linda, and they had a son called Steve. And then using jQuery, you just start it like this, as you would do with class names. The first one just finds all males. The second one finds any element which has a gender set, and the third one is faster. This limits this first one to, or the second one to all elements that are of the type list item. This is way faster because jQuery and JavaScript in general can first make a selection based on that element type and then only search for data attributes in there. So this works perfectly fine. And then I blogged about this. This is basically the response I got from readers. Normally I have like 12 readers on my blog on a daily basis. When I published this in, I think it was January or February, I got like an instant nearly 4,000 visitors on the first day because someone put me in Hacker News. That someone was me because no one else puts my stuff up on Hacker News. People were telling me you're doing it wrong because this is going to be so slow. This is so much slower than using class names in JavaScript. Mobile, this is going to kill things. You're doing it so wrong, you're killing the internet. I was like, okay, well, I haven't accomplished much in my life, but if killing the internet can be one. Pretty awesome. Later, I just thought I need to have a pretty good test case to prove them wrong. So what did I do? If you want to run a test, you can go to roy.io/data test, which uses jsperf.com. I went to cnn.com, downloaded their homepage HTML. To every div and every list item, I added the class names, saying gender and male and female. I added some data attributes as well. So we're talking about a DOM tree of over 1,300 different elements. 751 of those now have class names and gender data attributes. And I just ran a test. I wanted to see how often can I find those devices using, or find those elements using jQuery based on class names and data attributes. Well, this is the outcome. As you see, Chrome is the fastest by far. The first value is finding elements by class name, and the second one is finding elements by data attribute. Chrome, using data attributes, is only 4.9% slower. Safari 6, 2.9. Android 4, a bit more, but still pretty fast. Surprisingly, iOS 5 is slower than Android 4. The iOS 5 test was run on iPad 3, where the Android 4 test was run on the cheapest HTC Android I could buy. So that was interesting. But still, the differences aren't that large, unless you get into IE territory, and it's actually 67% slower. But still, IE is way, way slower, about 111 times per second. So you have this huge DOM tree of over 1,300 elements. Over 700 of those actually have those class names and data attributes. And you can still find those. Half of them have the gender male. You can still find all those males 111 times per second. This is not too slow to use in real life. If a user comes to your page and you often just find those elements and want to bind HTML, JavaScript to it, for instance, that's like 10 milliseconds. That's still super fast. So I suggest just doing it like this. And people might look at you a bit funny, but that's okay. I'm used to it. Now, there's modular file structure. You have your structure, your styling, your behavior, but those files need to go somewhere. So what I do, I use a single Sass file per module. I use a single CoffeeScript file per module. And I use one partial per module or not. Partials can generate a lot of I/O output and input, obviously. That's why I often end up with actually copy-pasting the HTML and creating a partial for everything on a single page, which is probably the best way to go. And Sprockets is always right. I've been trying to get this into the Rails guys for a while. You don't want to use Sprockets with Sass. So how does my structure look like? There's one application, let's see Sass.sass. Then I have 3 directories with base classes of the base styling, generic, and modules. Base could be a reset, a grid, importing compass if you use that. Generic could be generic text styling, forms, buttons. And the actual modules are those reusable elements you're going to use throughout your application. Well, my Sass file looks like this. First import compass reset, because that's what I always use. Then import all files in base, in generic, and modules. Doing it like this, you know for sure that your base styling is loaded first, then your generic, and then your modules, because your modules may depend on the previous 2. The order in which the modules are loaded doesn't matter at all. So JavaScript as well, it's basically the exact same structure. And for this I use Sprockets, just an application.js, and for generic stuff and your modules, if they require JavaScript. And then the application.js just looks like this, requires some trees, just the normal Sprockets way. So if you do it like this, I believe your code will look like this. Well, the little clock on the wall says we're just about out of time, but we do have time for questions. So if anyone has some, this would be a great time.
I know that most development teams in Ukraine, they're used to use the following approach when one person is writing HTML and CSS and the other person is writing JavaScript and Ruby. So it is not always similar to what you've described. So how do you think how this fact will impact the principles you define?
What first you need to discuss, I think, together, like the JavaScript and HTML, CSS person to define what those modules are. Get some naming standards, so they actually call this article the article itself. And you will need the HTML first before being able to write JavaScript for it. But that's always the case, I guess, because if you don't know the HTML structure, you can't apply JavaScript to it. Yeah, it needs some more talking and it needs some pair programming maybe, and trying to keep stuff in sync. Once the HTML is done, it's usually safe for one guy to start writing JavaScript and the other to start writing CSS. That shouldn't bite each other too much, but you need to start with the HTML structure. And maybe it's a good idea to just pair program on the HTML and then work on the JavaScript and CSS in separate teams.
So you're considering losing the consistency between, for example, CSS modules and JavaScript modules a problem, right?
Yeah, I don't see that. Sorry, come again.
Do you consider the losing consistency between JavaScript models and CSS models a really big problem?
Yeah. Especially if someone else needs to maintain that code in the future, needs to make a change. You want to be able to, like when I go into the code, I see this mod-articles class name somewhere, then I know that within my style sheets directory there's a file called articles. In my JavaScript directory there's a file called articles, and that's just easy to find your way around. And that's more of a convention than it is a rule. That's just what works good for us, but I'm not saying that it's the best solution for your team. Anyone else?
Yeah, hi. Just a small question. What about modern MVC frameworks? And do you use them? How it integrates with what you presented us?
Yeah. I'm not sure if the mic was on. Just how does this handle modern MVC frameworks? It pretty much doesn't. This is all for projects. I've only used it on projects that were written from scratch. Projects that were your fairly standard Rails apps. Nothing going with Backbone or anything like that. This approach may not be the best when you use MVC framework like that, or you may need to tweak it. Yeah.
You mentioned that nested. I think you mentioned that nested modules are evil. So what is the best practice? What's the recommended approach if you do have something like buttons in your if you are the modules? Do you just copy paste the code, or there are some other recommendations to follow?
Yeah. So if you want to yank that out, just copy paste the code to a new file. And remove it like from all other instances in your CSS as well, obviously. Keep things clean, like refactor all the fucking time. So yeah, just copy paste. You don't always have to just start from scratch. A lot of these things in your current application you can just fix by cleaning up your code, moving it to new files for a better overview and a better understanding of your code without actually rewriting everything. So copy paste probably solves 75% of your issues. It's saving you a lot of time there. Anyone? Just throw.
As you know, there are this anti-pattern like copy pattern. Yeah, so let's say it is will be more complicated to maintain because we should do changes in several places. Did you meet this problem?
So with HTML or CSS?
HTML.
Yeah, but so if I understand the question correctly, you have your HTML, you copy paste it in multiple places. You have to make this small styling change. You change your CSS in one place, but it means you need to change your HTML everywhere you copy paste it into, right? It depends. If it warrants using a partial, use a partial. I don't use partials for everything. Like ideally, I do the same as my CSS on my JavaScript. I have a page that only renders partials, and that's it. Partial for everything. That doesn't work too well. But if you find yourself in that position, you're probably best off using a partial. Just don't put everything in partials. The partials are made for exactly solving that issue. So if you encounter that, just use a partial.
Okay, and the next question is, we have some specification what and how we should do, and in this way we have a synthetic art. Did you think about it? Did you thought about it? Like,
I think you need to explain a bit more.
We have more rules how we should act, but art do not provide rules for us. We can be free. In this way, we are not free.
Yeah, that's true. This is a different approach, and you can either use this approach or not. If you have something else that works good for you, definitely use that. I found in the long run, especially backend developers see some benefits in doing it like this. But if you have a different approach, I'm not saying you're doing it wrong. This is a way of doing things. If you have a different way that works in your organization, definitely keep doing so, because you have to do what works well for you.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else?
Hi. I've got a tricky question. What about uniqueness of ID for JavaScript?
Yeah.
You can't use, for example, you have two articles, and you have ID mod articles, and then the next article has the same ID. You can't use it.
Yeah, so then you're, in that case, don't use data attributes as well.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Oh, that was so easy. No one else? Well, if that was it, I won't be keeping you from having lunch. So enjoy, and I think we'll be back at 1:30, right? Oh, and you slide again.